Her own family just threw her from a moving wagon and left her to die in the desert. The cheek of her face scraped raw against the baked New Mexico earth as the wagon rumbled on, not even slowing down. A moment later, a bundle, her few belongings, was tossed out after her, landing in the dust with a pathetic thud. They treated her like garbage, like something to be discarded. "You were his mistake," a voice hissed from the wagon. It was her sister-in-law, Martha. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Not ours. And just like that, they were gone. A cloud of dust was all that remained of the life she'd known. They vanished over the horizon, leaving Ada broken, widowed, and utterly alone under a sun that felt like it wanted to burn her from the world. She lay there for a long time. The pain in her ribs, where her brother-in-law had shoved her, was a dull, throbbing ache. But it was nothing compared to the vast, screaming emptiness in her chest. It had only been a week since the fever had taken her husband, Thomas. 1 week. It felt like a lifetime. But his death wasn't enough for them. Their hate was a living thing, and it needed more than just his absence to be satisfied. It needed to erase her, too. They had been polite, almost kind, through the burial. They'd let her mourn. They'd stood by her side as the dirt covered his coffin. But the second the final prayer was said, the kindness vanished. It was replaced by something cold and cruel. They dragged her from the home she had shared with Thomas, their hands like claws, their words like stones. "You're Apache by blood," her father-in-law had snarled, his face inches from hers. "You never belonged in our house. You were a stain on our family, a blight on his soul." She hadn't fought back. What could she say? What power did a widow, a half-blood woman, have against men who held a Bible in one hand and a knife in the other? They wore their faith like armor, but underneath, they were rotten to the core. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the ground. She brushed the sand and grit from her torn cheek, her eyes scanning the endless, shimmering horizon. The sun was a cruel, white eye in the sky. High above, buzzards were already beginning to circle. They could smell her despair. She had to move. She limped toward a line of distant, hazy hills, not knowing if they held water or just more death. Every step was agony. By the time the sun began to bleed across the western sky, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her feet were a mess of raw, weeping blisters. But she kept walking. As the darkness deepened, she started whispering names into the dry air, the names of her mother, her grandmothers, the Apache names they had tried to beat out of her when she married Thomas, when she took his family's name, Foster, a name that now felt like a curse. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. All that was left was the rhythmic crunch of gravel under her worn-out shoes and the low, animal growl of a hunger that was starting to consume her from the inside out. She was so focused on the pain, on the names, that she almost didn't see it. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of a mesquite grove. It wasn't an animal, it was a man. She didn't flinch. She was too tired to be afraid. If this was how it ended, then let it end. But the figure that stepped into the faint moonlight wasn't a bandit or a demon. He was Apache. He was lean and young, with a streak of black war paint across one cheek and a longbow slung over his shoulder. He moved with a silence that was both unnerving and beautiful. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at her. His eyes were dark and piercing, taking in every detail of her broken state, the torn dress, the bruises blooming on her arms, the raw scrape on her face. But he also saw the stubborn, defiant way she held her chin up, even now. "You're not dead," he said finally. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Yet," she rasped, her throat feeling like it was full of sand. He studied her for another long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he unhooked a water skin from his belt and held it out to her. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. She drank slowly, cautiously, the cool water a miracle on her scorched throat. It was the first act of kindness she'd been shown in a week. "Why are you out here?" he asked, his eyes still narrowed, still searching her face for something. "Because I was born wrong," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. He gave a single sharp nod, as if that was the only explanation that made any sense in this broken world. As if he understood completely. "Then you'll live," he said, a strange certainty in his voice. "The wrong ones always fight harder." And with that, he turned and melted back into the trees. For a heartbeat, she thought he was leaving her too. But then he paused and looked back over his shoulder, a silent command in his eyes. She followed. What other choice did she have? Sometimes, the only people who can find you are the ones who are just as lost as you are. The pain in her feet was a constant, screaming torment. Each step over the sharp rocks and thorny brush felt like walking on broken glass. But the warrior ahead of her never slowed, never looked back. He moved like a phantom through the rugged landscape, his steps silent and sure, as if the desert itself was an old friend. He expected her to keep up, and somehow she did. Pride, or maybe just sheer stubbornness, kept her moving. She wouldn't be weak. She wouldn't be left behind again. "Do you have a name?" she finally called out, her voice raspy from disuse and dust. He paused for a fraction of a second, his head tilting as he scanned the surrounding shadows. He was always watching, always listening. "Chattin'," he said, without turning around. "Son of Red Elk." Then he was moving again, his pace relentless. Ada grit her teeth and pushed onward, forcing her bruised body to obey. By the time they reached a hidden grove of ancient ironwood trees, the sky was a deep, bruised violet. A fire was already built in a small, protected clearing, the wood stacked perfectly, tinder placed just so. It was as if this place had been waiting for them, as if he knew he wouldn't be returning alone tonight. The thought sent a small shiver down her spine. He gestured for her to sit, and she collapsed gratefully onto the cool, sandy ground. He knelt and struck a flint against steel. Sparks danced in the gathering gloom, and a small flame caught, licking at the dry wood. "Why help me?" she asked, watching the firelight flicker across his stern, painted face. He didn't look at her. He was focused on coaxing the flame to life. "I saw a buzzard circling," he replied, his voice low. "But when I got closer, I found something that was still breathing." A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. It was a harsh, ugly sound, but it felt good. It felt real. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt something other than grief or fear. "You live out here alone?" she asked, trying to fill the heavy silence between them. He nodded once, feeding a larger stick into the growing fire. "Since my village was burned. The cavalry came in the spring. Said we were squatting on stolen land." His voice was flat, emotionless. But she saw his hands pause for just a second, his knuckles white as he gripped the piece of wood. "They said I was too young to die," he continued, his gaze lost in the flames. "So they left me. They made me watch it all burn." Ada swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. His pain was a mirror to her own, a different kind of abandonment, a different kind of fire. She felt a strange, unwelcome kinship with this dangerous, silent man. "I was married to a white man," she confessed, the words tasting like ash. "His family. After he died, they said I had betrayed my blood." Chayton finally looked up from the fire, his dark eyes meeting hers across the flickering flames. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet, intense curiosity. "And did you?" "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. "I loved him. But they only loved him when he was healthy and strong. When he got sick, when he was weak, I became the scapegoat. I became the mistake they couldn't forgive." The fire crackled between them, a silent witness to their shared stories of loss and betrayal. The world had tried to break them both in its own unique ways. He tossed her a strip of dried meat without a word. She caught it, her fingers trembling slightly. It was tough and salty, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Where do I go from here?" she asked, the question hanging in the dark air. It was a question she was terrified to answer herself. Chayton looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to pierce the darkness like diamond dust. "Wherever you want," he said simply. "But if you stay the night, you earn your keep." She nodded slowly, a sense of purpose, however small, beginning to flicker inside her. "I can sew. I can clean hides. I can trap small game. I won't be dead weight." "Good," he said, his gaze returning to the fire. "Then sleep. You'll need your strength." Later, wrapped in a hide blanket he had given her, Ada lay beneath the gnarled branches of the ironwood trees. She listened to the steady crackle of the fire and the quiet, rhythmic sound of Chayton's breathing. He sat watch, a silent guardian in the darkness. For the first time in weeks, her body was at rest. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was, for this one night, safe. But her soul was a different story. It wasn't resting. It was beginning to sharpen. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Ada was already awake, pulling sinew through a rabbit hide with fingers that were stiff and sore, but surprisingly steady. Her old life felt 1,000,000 miles away. The woman who had served tea in porcelain cups was gone. This woman, with raw hands and a vengeful ache in her heart, was someone new. Across the small clearing, Chayton crouched by a trickling creek, sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shing-shing-shing of the blade on stone was the only sound in the quiet grove. The silence between them had changed overnight. It wasn't hostile or awkward anymore. It was thick, with unspoken questions, with shared trauma that didn't need words to be understood. She was the one who broke it. "You don't speak much," she observed, her voice still a little rough. He didn't look up from his task. The morning light caught the silver edge of the blade as he drew it across the stone. "Words cost more than most people know," he said. She thought about that. She thought about all the words her husband's family had used. Words like filth, savage, mistake. They had used their words like weapons, and they had cost her everything. This silent warrior understood that in his bones. She watched the way the light played across the scars on his arms and back. Some were clean, straight lines. Others were jagged, ugly marks of a past he never asked for. "I wasn't raised in the tribe," she found herself saying, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. "My mother left when I was a child. She married a preacher in Tucson. I didn't know our songs, our history. I only knew that I was different. I wasn't like the other girls with their lace dresses and pale skin." Chayton's hands stilled for a moment. He set the knife and stone aside and finally turned to face her, his eyes unblinking. "Blood remembers," he said, his voice low and certain, "even when the tongue forgets." "Then why do they hate me?" she asked, the question raw and desperate. "Your people? My people?" "Because you make them see what they tried to bury," he said, his insight so sharp it was like a physical blow. "You walk like you have a foot in two different worlds, like you were pulled in half. But somehow you're still standing. And that terrifies people who have only ever known one world, one way, one truth." Ada blinked, startled. He saw her. He didn't just see a broken woman, a half-blood outcast. He saw the war inside her, and he wasn't afraid of it. "You think I'm strong?" she asked, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, hope igniting in her chest. "No," he said, and her heart sank. "I think you're unfinished." A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. "Well," she said, picking up her needle again, "that makes two of us." A new understanding passed between them. They spent the morning working in a comfortable silence, him weaving intricate traps from sinew and branches, her preparing the hides with a focus she didn't know she possessed. There was a rhythm to their work, a shared purpose that needed no words. Suddenly, a hawk cried out overhead, its call sharp and piercing. Chayton was on his feet in an instant, his head cocked, his body tense. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. Ada listened. The hawk cried out again, but underneath it, almost lost in the wind, was another sound. A second cry. It was faint, desperate, and it was human. Without a word, they both moved. They followed the sound through the low brush and thorny scrub, Chayton leading the way, his knife now in his hand. The cries grew louder, weaker, punctuated by ragged sobs. They found him in a shallow ravine. A boy, no older than 10, his leg caught and twisted at a sickening angle in a metal hunter's snare. The steel jaws had bitten deep into his calf. "Help!" he sobbed when he saw them, his eyes wide with terror and pain. "Please, you have to help me. They'll come back. My paw and the others, they'll come back for me." Chayton knelt beside the boy, his movements quick and efficient. With a grunt of effort, he wrenched the steel jaws of the trap apart, freeing the boy's mangled leg. "You're safe now," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he lifted the small child into his arms. The boy's story came out in broken, terrified gasps. They said to leave me if I slowed them down," he muttered, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. "Pa said I was a burden. He said they already left." "Not everyone leaves," Ada said softly, reaching out to touch the boy's trembling shoulder. He flinched at her touch but didn't pull away. As they made their way back to the hidden grove, the boy cradled carefully in Chayton's arms. Ada felt something shift inside her. A profound and irreversible change. This wasn't the end of her story, her exile, her pain. It wasn't a punishment. It was a beginning. She was being forged into something new, something stronger. And she was no longer alone. This small, broken family, born of violence and abandonment, was hers now. But a cold dread was beginning to creep into her heart. Who were they? Who was this Pa who would leave his own son to die in a trap? And what were they doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She had a terrible feeling she already knew the answer. They said they were going to cleanse the valley. The boy's voice was a brittle whisper in the firelight. He was curled up beside the flames, a hide blanket wrapped tightly around his small shoulders, his splinted leg propped up on a bed of soft moss. His name was Ben. They said it was God's work, he continued, his eyes wide and haunted with a memory he was too young to carry. Burning out the savages, and the half-bloods hiding in the rocks. Across the fire, Chayton sat perfectly still, but Ada could see the muscles in his jaw bunching into hard knots. His knuckles were white where he gripped the handle of his knife. The boy's words were like gasoline on a fire that had been smoldering inside him for years. "They had torches," Ben whispered, his whole body trembling now, "and new rifles, and a map. Pa had a map with red marks all over it. He said we had to ride light and fast. He said anyone who slowed us down wasn't one of God's chosen." Ada reached out and took the boy's small, cold hand, her heart aching for him. She knew what it was like to be deemed unworthy by the people who were supposed to love you. "You are not what they left behind," she said, her voice fierce and low. "You are what they couldn't control. You remember that." Ben looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a tiny spark of the fight that Chayton had spoken of. The fragile, terrified shell around him seemed to unclench just a little. "What's your name?" she asked gently. He hesitated for a long moment, as if the name itself was a burden. "Ben," he said finally. "Ben Foster." "Foster." The name hit Ada like a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs. Foster. It was her name. Her married name. The name of the family who had cast her out, who had spit on her and left her for dead. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A cruel, impossible coincidence. But when she looked at the boy's face, at the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, she saw it. A faint, horrifying echo of her late husband, Thomas, and a much stronger, chilling resemblance to his father, her father-in-law, Silas Foster, the man who had called her a stain on his family. The man whose hate was so pure it was almost a religion. This boy, this abandoned child, was her nephew. Chayton stood up abruptly, his face a mask of stone, and melted into the trees without a word. Ada let him go. She was beginning to understand his silences. This wasn't absence. This was a rage so deep and so clean it didn't need to shout. It was the quiet, cold fury of a man who had seen this kind of cleansing before. Later, she found him at the edge of the grove, sharpening arrows in the moonlight, his movements sharp and precise. Each pull of the flint across the arrowhead was a promise of violence. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "The men who left Ben, they're my husband's family." "Yes," he replied, not looking up from his work. "They call themselves the Righteous Hand. They're not just clearing land, they're erasing people. They want to prove that no one like us belongs in a world they believe they own." A cold fear, colder than any she had felt in the desert, washed over her. This wasn't a random act of bigotry. This was an organized, systematic extermination. And her own family, the family she had married into, was leading it. "So we run?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He finally looked up, his eyes catching the moonlight. They were hard and bright, like chips of obsidian. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "We stand. But we don't do it alone." At dawn, they left the ironwood grove behind. With Ben carried carefully on Chatton's back, they moved east, deeper into the rugged, unforgiving wilderness. Chayton led them through a maze of narrow, winding gullies and ancient game trails that only he seemed to know. He pointed out petroglyphs carved into the canyon walls, stories of hunts and gods from a time long past. "This land still remembers," he said, his hand tracing the outline of a spiral carved into the rock, "and it will protect what it claims as its own." They reached a wide, deep canyon by nightfall. The walls were sheer and rose hundreds of feet into the air, a natural fortress. The sky above was a brilliant tapestry of stars. "We rest here," Chayton announced, "and tomorrow we call the old blood." Ada didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. She could feel it in the air, in the stones beneath her feet. This was a sacred place, a place of power. That night, as Ben slept soundly beside her, she watched Chatton by the fire. He was using a charred stick to trace intricate patterns in the ash on the canyon floor. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly. He looked up, his expression serious. "A map," he said, "for those who have forgotten the way back home." She felt the immense weight of it then, the past, the future, the bloody war between names and bloodlines, between faith and fanaticism. Her personal tragedy was part of a much larger, much older story. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that when the righteous hand came, when the fire and steel of Silas Foster's holy war arrived to finish what his hatred had started, they would not find a broken widow and a lost boy. They would find something else entirely, something wild, something wounded, and something that was finally ready to fight back. At the first light of dawn, Chayton stood on a high ledge at the canyon's edge. His arms were outstretched to the rising sun, and he began to chant. It was a sound Ada had never heard before, a low, guttural rhythm that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. It wasn't a prayer of supplication, it was a summons. The sound rose on the morning air, echoing off the stone walls, a current of ancient power flowing from deep within his chest. Ada watched from below, her hand resting on Ben's sleeping shoulder. She could feel the vibration of the chant through the soles of her feet, as if the land itself was waking from a long, troubled sleep. Ben stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He stared up at the figure on the ledge, his expression a mixture of fear and awe. "What's he saying?" he whispered. "He's calling them," Ada replied, her voice hushed. "The ones who still remember, the ones the world tried to forget." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The only answer to Chaitin's call was the mournful cry of the wind whistling through the canyon. A knot of despair began to tighten in Ada's stomach. What if no one came? What if they were truly the last ones left? But then, as dusk began to settle, painting the canyon in shades of orange and purple, the wind shifted. The birds fell silent. The air grew heavy, electric with anticipation. And then they came. They appeared not like an army, but like ghosts materializing from the landscape itself. First, a single woman emerged from the brush, her hair as white as snow, her face a beautiful cracked map of sun and time. She carried a staff carved from a single piece of driftwood. Then came two brothers, their faces grim, their bodies lean and hard as the rock they walked on. They carried spears tipped with razor-sharp obsidian. One by one, they stepped out of the shadows, from behind boulders and down hidden crevices in the cliff face. Old warriors with eyes that had seen too much, young scouts who moved with the grace of predators, women whose hands were as skilled with a bow as they were with a needle. Their faces were marked with the bloodlines of a dozen scattered and broken tribes, lineages the government had tried and failed to erase from the map. They were the forgotten ones, the survivors, the wrong ones. The old woman with the white braids was the first to speak. She stopped before Chaitin, her dark eyes studying him intently. "We heard your fire song on the wind," she said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "We saw the smoke from the villages they burned. Now we stand with you." Chaitin gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement, but Ada, standing closer now, saw his hand clench into a fist at his side. He was grateful, but he was also afraid. He knew what their arrival meant. These people didn't gather for a celebration. They only came together when death was on the wind. "They'll be here within days," Chaitin announced to the assembled group, his voice grim. "Silas Foster and his righteous hand. They have rifles, and they have the law and a twisted God on their side." "Let them come," said the younger of the two brothers, a dangerous smile touching his lips. He spat on the ground. "We've buried gods before." That night, the canyon was transformed. It became a war camp. A quiet, deadly purpose settled over everyone. Spears were checked and bound. Arrowheads were sharpened until they gleamed in the firelight. Deep pit traps were dug and expertly concealed at the narrow mouth of the canyon. Ada worked alongside them, her hands moving with a purpose she had never known. She stretched and strung bowstrings until her fingers bled. She ground bitter roots into a paste for treating wounds. She was no longer Ada Foster, the preacher's wife, the widow left to rot. She was Ada of the Kutina, the place that waited. She was a part of this now, a part of a living memory that was sharper and more resilient than any steel blade. Ben watched everything, his young eyes soaking it all in. He was no longer the discarded, crying child from the ravine. He moved among the warriors, fetching water, carrying bundles of arrows, his limp less pronounced, his back straighter. "If I had a bow," he said to Ada, his voice quiet but firm, "I'd stand with you." Ada knelt in front of him, her heart swelling with a fierce protective love. She pressed a small carved bone pendant into his palm. It was a figure of a running wolf. "You will stand," she said softly, "but your fight is to live. You carry our story forward. That is your stand. Promise me." He clutched the pendant tightly and nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Later that night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, flashing silently in the distance, Chayton came and sat beside her. The firelight danced in his eyes, making them look like pools of liquid darkness. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "I was," she admitted, looking out at the faces around the fire. The faces of warriors painting themselves in the old ways, the face of a child clinging to a newfound courage. "I was terrified, until I realized I wasn't alone anymore." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was rough and warm, calloused from work and war. It was the most comforting thing she had ever felt. "We fight as one now," he said. Ada looked from his face to the stormy sky, then back to the fire. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that when the fire of the righteous hand came to this canyon, it would not find easy prey. It would find an answer. It would find a fire of its own. They came like a plague of locusts, a cloud of dust on the horizon that slowly resolved into 20 men on horseback. They wore dark coats and wide-brimmed hats, their new rifles gleaming in the morning sun. Their faces were set in grim, self-assured lines, their smiles crooked with the absolute certainty of their righteousness. At the narrow mouth of the canyon, they halted. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with polished silver buttons on his coat and a puckered white scar running down his cheek, spurred his horse forward. It was him, Silas Foster, Ada's father-in-law, the man who had condemned her to die. He raised a rolled-up scroll in his hand, his voice booming across the distance, echoing off the canyon walls like a curse. "By order of the territorial governor, and by the divine authority of Almighty God, all squatters, heathens, and miscegenate vagrants are hereby ordered to vacate this land immediately. Surrender now, or you will be removed by force." From a ledge high above, Chatton stood tall, a lone, defiant figure against the bright blue sky. He was unmoving, unblinking. "This land answers to no paper law," he called down, his voice clear and sharp, cutting through the morning air. "It answers only to blood and bone." Silas Foster smirked, a cruel, ugly twisting of his lips. He looked directly up at Ada, who stood near Chayton, her own bow now strung and ready. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. "Then it is your blood that will stain it, Apache whore," he roared. "Just like your mother's before you." No shots were fired. Not yet. It was a standoff, a battle of wills played out under a sky that felt too calm, too beautiful for the ugliness that was about to unfold. Ada could see her sister-in-law, Martha, sitting on a horse just behind her father, her face a pale mask of vindictive fury. This was a family reunion of the most twisted kind. "Will they attack now?" Ada whispered, her knuckles white on the grip of her bow. "They already have," Chayton said, his voice a low growl. "This is their way. They use words as their first volley. Now they wait for us to kneel." From a nearby ledge, the old woman with the white braids stepped forward, her ancient face serene. She raised her driftwood staff, which was adorned with crow feathers that fluttered in the breeze. "We do not kneel," she called down, her voice surprisingly strong. "Not to men of iron, not to the ghosts of thieves." A few of the riders below laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that grated on Ada's nerves. Then, they pulled back a short distance and began to make camp, setting up tents and positioning men as sentries. They were settling in for a siege. "They'll wait for darkness," Chayton muttered, his eyes never leaving the enemy camp. "They are cowards, using the law as armor for their hate." That evening, the tension in the canyon was a physical thing, so thick you could almost taste it. The fires burned low and quiet. The warriors painted their faces with symbols of strength and death. Ada found Ben, huddled in a small cave at the rear of the canyon, which had been designated as a shelter for the non-combatants. She knelt beside him, wrapping his leg bandage tighter. She kissed his forehead, her lips brushing against his feverish skin. "You stay here," she commanded, her voice soft but firm. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay hidden. Promise me, Ben. Promise me, even if you hear me scream." He looked at her, his young eyes glassy with fear, but also with a grim determination that broke her heart. He nodded silently. Just before the last light faded, Chayton found her standing at the edge of the cliff, watching the enemy fires bloom like evil flowers in the valley below. "You were right," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "About what?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the camp. "The wrong ones," he said. "They do fight harder." She finally turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the last vestiges of twilight. Her voice was steady, clear, and free of the fear that had plagued her for so long. "We're not wrong," she said. "We were just unclaimed." He reached out and gently touched her face, his rough thumb tracing the faint scar on her temple where she had fallen from the wagon. His touch was electric. "Then I claim you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "Ada of the Kutina, if we die tonight, we die as one heart." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second. She wasn't the cast-aside widow anymore. She wasn't the mistake. She was a guardian, a warrior, a woman standing guard over this fire, this land, and this man's heart. Far below, in the deepening darkness, the riders of the righteous hand sharpened their blades and loaded their rifles, praying to their God for a swift and bloody victory. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the rocks above. The night didn't break with the thunder of a charge. It was shattered by a single piercing scream. But it didn't come from the canyon. It came from the riders' camp. The sound was sharp, sudden, and full of agony, like a deer caught in a steel trap. Ada jolted upright, her hand instinctively going to the arrows at her side. Beside her, Chayton was already moving, leaping from his spot by the fire and scaling the ridge with the silent, practiced ease of a mountain cat. Shadows danced at the canyon's edge. Then, a bright orange flare lit up the night as one of the riders' tents erupted in flames. Shouts of confusion and panic echoed up the slopes. Horses screamed and bucked, pulling their tethers loose and bolting into the darkness. "They weren't ready," Chayton said from the ridge above, his eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding below. "Someone else struck first." Before Ada could ask who, a figure emerged from the trees near the canyon rim. It was one of the young scouts, the brother with the obsidian spear, his face painted black for the night. His bow was still raised. "They fired the first threats," the scout said, his voice flat and cold. "So we lit the first fire." A wave of wild, panicked gunfire erupted from the camp below. Bullets whined through the air, ricocheting off the stone walls around them. One struck the rock near Ada's feet, sending chips of stone stinging against her leg. She ducked behind a boulder, her heart pounding a furious rhythm against her ribs. "Hold the line!" Chayton's voice boomed from above, a commander taking charge. "Don't waste your arrows! Let them bleed their own fear out on the rocks!" The warriors fanned out along the canyon walls, silent and disciplined. They melted into the shadows, becoming one with the stone. Bows were notched, eyes keen, waiting for a clean shot. Ada knelt beside a rocky outcropping, forcing her breathing to slow, scanning the chaotic scene below for a target. She saw him, a rider, creeping up the slope, trying to get a flanking position. His rifle was in his hands, his face pale and terrified in the flickering firelight. She drew her bowstring back to her cheek. She took a breath, held it, and released. The world seemed to slow for a single second. The arrow flew true, a dark streak in the night. It struck the rider in the thigh, and he went down with a strangled howl, tumbling back down the rocky incline. A grim satisfaction settled in her gut. "Good shot," a low voice said from beside her. Chayton had moved to her position, as silent as a ghost. "You shoot like you've done this before." "I've been hunted long enough," she said, notching another arrow. "It's my turn to hunt back." The night became a terrifying dance of fire and shadow. The battle raged in waves. Short, furious skirmishes would flare up, followed by tense, eerie lulls. The acrid smell of gunpowder and burning canvas stung the air. Ada moved through it all like a phantom. She was no longer just defending. She was attacking. She loosed arrows with deadly accuracy, helped pull a wounded warrior to cover, whispered words of courage into the ears of young fighters who were on the verge of breaking. And through it all, she was aware of Ben. From the relative safety of the rear cave, he watched. He wasn't crying or hiding. He was clutching the small knife she had given him, his eyes wide, tracking every movement, every muzzle flash, like a hawk learning to hunt. Near midnight, a deep lull fell over the canyon. The riders, bloodied and disorganized, had pulled back to their burning, chaotic camp. The sounds of their confident war cries had been replaced by the cries of their wounded. Their righteous fire had dimmed to little more than smoldering embers. "They'll try again at dawn," Chayton said, his voice grim as he knelt beside her. "They'll be smarter this time. Harsher." Ada wiped a smear of soot and sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked at him, her eyes hard in the dim light. "Then so will we," she replied. As the warriors tended to their few wounded and restrung their bows, Ada went to the cave. She sat beside Ben and took his small, trembling hand in hers. "You still with me?" she asked softly. "Always," he said, his jaw set, his voice surprisingly steady. "Even if I'm scared." "Good," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Only fools fight without fear." Overhead, the silent stars bore witness. The land, which had seen so much bloodshed, was quiet once more. But it was a temporary peace. Below them, in the smoldering ruins of their camp, hatred was regrouping. And everyone in the canyon knew that the battle for the morning would be the battle for everything. They didn't wait for the sun to rise fully. They came with the first gray light of dawn, not with stealth, but with rage and thunder. Riders charged hard and fast into the canyon's mouth, their voices raised in a furious, holy chant. This time, they had torches tied to their spear tips, a wave of fire and steel aimed at the heart of the canyon. Ada was already on the ridge, her breath catching in her throat as a flaming arrow arced through the air and struck a dry cedar post near the entrance, which instantly exploded into a column of fire. "They're trying to smoke us out! To burn us alive!" Chayton growled beside her. He was already moving, already shouting orders in the old tongue, his voice a sharp, commanding bark that cut through the chaos. The warriors responded instantly. There was no panic, only a grim, deadly efficiency. They formed lines at the natural choke points they had prepared. The women moved the children and the few wounded deeper into the network of caves at the rear. A volley of arrows flew from the ridges, fast and sharp, felling the first two riders from their horses. Ada's eyes frantically searched for Ben. A surge of pure terror, cold and sharp, lanced through her when she couldn't see him in the designated shelter. But then, she spotted him. He wasn't hiding. He was crouched beside the old woman with the white braids, who was firing arrow after arrow with the speed of a woman half her age. Ben was her quiver, handing her fresh shafts from a pile at his side, his small face set with intense concentration. "Smart boy," Ada breathed, a swell of pride pushing back the fear. She raised her own bow and loosed an arrow, sending another rider screaming into the dust. The battle devolved into brutal, close-quarters chaos. The smoke from the fires grew thick and oily, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. The canyon became a hellscape of screams, gunshots, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. A big, bearded rider broke through the lower trap line, his horse trampling one of the obsidian-tipped spears. He was screaming her name. "Ada, you cursed widow! Come out and see the justice of God!" It was Jed, her brother-in-law, the one who had shoved her from the wagon. She didn't hesitate. She met him head-on. As he swung his heavy rifle at her head like a club, she ducked under the blow, the stock whistling past her ear. She came up inside his reach and drove the splintered shaft of a broken spear deep into his gut. He gasped, a look of pure shock on his face. He coughed, a spray of blood erupting from his lips, and then he toppled from his saddle, his eyes wide with the disbelief that she, the quiet, timid woman he had brutalized, had actually fought back. The victory felt hollow, tasting only of ash. Then, a single shot rang out, louder than the rest, from a high ledge where Silas Foster stood, a long rifle in his hands, and Chayton fell. Ada turned, her world narrowing to a single point of absolute horror. She saw him clutch his side, a dark stain of blood immediately blossoming between his fingers. "No," she whispered. The word was a prayer, a denial. "No!" She ran to him, ignoring the bullets that whined past her head. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him behind the cover of a large boulder, her hands pressing down hard on his wound, trying to staunch the flow of lifeblood. "You don't get to leave me," she sobbed, the tears she'd held back for so long finally breaking free. "Not now. You don't get to leave me alone again." He gritted his teeth, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "It's not deep," he gasped. "Just hurts like hell." His breath hitched, but his eyes were still clear, still fierce. "They're retreating. I can hear it." And he was right. The charge had been broken. The riders of the righteous hand, their numbers decimated, their holy fire extinguished, were turning and fleeing. Their righteous crusade had devolved into a panicked, shameful rout. The remaining warriors didn't chase them. They stood their ground, silent and grim, watching the last of their enemies vanish into the hazy morning light. Ada cradled Chayton's head in her lap, her body trembling with a violent cocktail of rage, relief, and something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly like love. "It's over," she whispered, her tears dripping onto his face. "Not yet," he murmured, his eyes fluttering closed. His hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. Now we begin." Around them, the canyon steamed with smoke and blood. Wounded warriors cried out in pain. The smell of death was heavy in the air. But above it all, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The land had held. The fire had been answered, and they had survived. The ash settled on everything, a fine gray powder that coated skin, stone, and memory. In the days that followed the battle, Ada walked the canyon floor with a careful, reverent tread, as if she were walking through a graveyard of all the things she had almost lost. The fires were out. The dead, on both sides, had been buried. The wounded were laid in a circle near the heart of the canyon, where the old woman and the other healers sang low, rhythmic songs to coax their spirits back to strength. Chayton lay beneath a great stone archway, his fever finally broken. His wound had been cleaned and wrapped in a poultice of herbs that Ada had prepared herself. He was still weak, but he was breathing. He was alive. She spent most of her time sitting beside him, her fingers gently brushing the hair from his brow, whispering old stories her grandmother had told her, stories she didn't even know she remembered. "You saved us," a soft voice said from behind her. She turned to see Ben standing there. The soot was finally washed from his cheeks, but his eyes held a new, older wisdom. He was no longer a frail, abandoned boy. He had faced the fire and had not flinched. "They won't come back," he said, a statement of fact, not a question. Ada looked at the boy who was her nephew, her charge, her brother in arms. He had stood his ground, not with a blade, but with a courage that was just as sharp. "They'll always come back," she said gently, her voice full of a truth she had learned in the dust and blood. "Hate like that doesn't just die. But now, so will we. We will always be here to meet them." A new spirit took hold of the canyon survivors. They began to rebuild, not from a place of fear or shame, but from a foundation of fire and defiance. New shelters of stone and wood rose beside the old ones. The songs that filled the canyon now were not just songs of healing, but songs of creation, of a new people being born in this scarred, sacred place. Ben was given an honored place among the young scouts, not for his skill with a weapon, but for the strength of his heart. The white-haired elder placed a necklace of carved eagle bone around his neck. "Your father named you Foster," she said, her voice raspy. "But your true name is Iapo, the one who carries light through the smoke." Ada found her own purpose. She spent her nights by the fire, her hands never still, mending cloth, grinding herbs, her thoughts running deeper than they ever had before. One evening, Chatton awoke fully. His voice was a dry rasp, but his eyes were clear and steady, and they were on her. "You stayed," he whispered. A slow smile spread across her face. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," she said. "You shouldn't have taken that bullet. Silas was aiming for me." "I didn't take it for you," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "I took it for us." She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, a gesture of profound intimacy that felt more natural than anything she had ever known. "Then I guess it's our wound to carry. Together." But that wasn't the end of the story. It was another beginning, because a strange thing started to happen. News travels on the wind in the desert. Stories are carried by traders, by trappers, by the wind itself. Stories of a battle in a hidden canyon. A story of a band of forgotten outcasts who stood against the fire of the righteous hand and did not burn. And so they started to arrive. At first, it was just one or two. A widow who had escaped a brutal husband, 2 runaway brothers from a reservation who were tired of starving, a lost son who had been raised by whites and felt like a ghost in his own skin. They came not as beggars, but as builders. They came seeking not shelter, but a home. They offered what little they had, a strong back, a skill with a knife, a story to tell around the fire. And the canyon took them in. Ada showed the women how to plant herbs in the warm, sheltered soil near the cliffs. She taught them how to mend leather with steady hands and a strong heart. Chayton, as he regained his strength, taught the men how to listen, how to truly listen, not just with their ears, but with their whole bodies, how to read the rhythm of the wind, the language of the birds, the deep, silent meaning in the stones. And then came the discovery that would change everything. While clearing the debris from the battle, one of the warriors found a small, locked metal box in the saddlebag of the dead Silas Foster. He brought it to Chayton and Ada. It was heavy, and the lock was strong. "Thomas gave me this," Chayton said, pulling a small, ornate key from a leather pouch around his neck. "Weeks before he died. He told me it held the truth. He said if anything happened to him, I was to find you and give this to you." Ada's hands trembled as she took the key. With Chatton beside her, she unlocked the box. Inside, there was no gold, no money. There was only a small, leather-bound journal. Thomas's journal. His familiar handwriting filled the pages. And as she read, the final, earth-shattering pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The truth was so much more complex and heartbreaking than she could ever have imagined. Thomas hadn't been a willing member of his family's hateful crusade. He had been their prisoner. He wrote of his father's growing fanaticism, the creation of the righteous hand, their secret raids and burnings. He had married Ada not just for love, but in a desperate, naive attempt to protect her, believing his position as Silas's son would be a shield. He had been secretly working against them, leaking information, trying to warn the very tribes his father was hunting. The map with the red marks that Ben had seen? It wasn't just a map of targets. It was a map of safe havens and escape routes that Thomas had been trying to get to the Apache. Chayton had been his contact. The fever that had killed him hadn't been a fever at all. It had been poison. His own sister, Martha, had discovered his journal and had slowly, methodically poisoned him to silence him, to stop his betrayal of their cause. The deed to the canyon that Silas had brandished was a forgery, created after Thomas's death to give their murderous crusade a veneer of legality. Ada's abandonment in the desert wasn't just an act of spite. It was to ensure the last witness to their secrets, the woman Thomas had died to protect, would perish. The last entry in the journal was a letter, written in a shaky, fading hand. "My dearest Ada, if you are reading this, then my family has succeeded, and I have failed. But my greatest failure would be if they harm you. They do not know of Chayton. He is a man of honor. Find him. He knows the paths. He will keep you safe. My love for you was not a mistake. It was the only true and righteous thing in my life. Live, Ada. Live for both of us. Burn bright enough to cast out their shadows. I love you." Tears streamed down Ada's face, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of rage, of understanding, of a profound and terrible love. She wasn't a mistake. She was his legacy. She was his last act of defiance. The canyon, once a place of exile, then a fortress, had now become a cradle for a new kind of truth. And Ada, once the cast aside, the broken, the wrong one, was now its beating, vengeful heart. They gathered at dawn, a year to the day after the battle. Every soul the canyon now cradled stood in the great natural amphitheater at its heart. Their scars, both visible and hidden, were testaments to their survival. A reverent silence settled over the crowd as the morning wind moved gently through the cliffs like a sacred breath. Ada stood at the center of the circle. Beside her, Chayton leaned on a carved staff, no longer a sign of weakness, but of authority. He was thinner than he had been, but his eyes were bright with a fire that would never go out. "This place once had no name," Chayton said, his voice clear and strong, carried on the morning air. "It was a patch of forgotten land on a thief's map. It was stolen, it was burned, it was left for dead." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "But now, it remembers." Ada stepped forward, her heart full, her voice steady and sure. "We were the forgotten ones," she said, her eyes finding Ben, who now stood tall and proud among the young scouts, the eagle bone necklace resting against his chest. "We were cast away, labeled as cursed, left to bleed our lives into the dust. But here, in this place, we found our truth." She turned to the women, who stood with their heads held high, their hands no longer trembling with fear. "Here, we found our voices again." Finally, she turned to Chayton, her voice softening but losing none of its strength. "And here, I found a man who gave me a choice when all I had ever known were chains." Chayton took her hand, his rough, warm palm enclosing hers, and he raised it high for all to see. "We are not exiles," he declared, his voice ringing with power. "We are not squatters. We are the chosen, chosen by each other, chosen by this land, chosen by the fire that refused to go out." The old woman, Iyapo's grandmother, stepped forward and scattered a mixture of sacred sage and crushed turquoise into the center of the circle. "Then give this place its name," she commanded. "Let it be known." Ada looked at the canyon walls, at the black scorch marks that were now overgrown with green, vibrant life. She looked at the faces of her people, this patchwork family of survivors and fighters, and she smiled. "We call it Thomas's Hope," she said. A cheer did not erupt. Instead, A profound silence embraced them, a silence deeper than awe, older than words. It was the silence of belonging, the silence of a people who had finally, against all odds, come home. That evening, they held a feast. Not a feast of wealth, but a feast of witness. Songs were sung in 4 different languages, their melodies weaving together to create a new kind of music. Fires danced across the stone walls, and children who had been born right here in the canyon, laughed and played in their light. Later, Ada walked barefoot along the high ridge, feeling the solid, living earth press back against the soles of her feet. It felt like a promise. Chayton joined her, his arms slipping easily around her waist. They stood together, watching the endless tapestry of stars wheel overhead. "I once thought I was meant to die alone out here," he said quietly. "So did I," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. He turned to her, a faint, rare smile on his lips. "We were both wrong." He looked down at the flickering lights and joyful sounds of their home below. "What now?" "Now," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that was as solid as the mountains around them. "We live, we grow, we remember, and we teach our children how to answer when the fire calls." Below them, the canyon pulsed with laughter, with music, with life reclaimed. No soldiers came, no riders dared to venture near this place. The story of the canyon had spread far and wide, a warning and a promise. The wolves had learned the scent of this new, stronger pack, and they no longer circled here. In the very place where the lost had been thrown away, the saved had risen. They had taken the worst of what the world could throw at them, hate, betrayal, and death, and they had forged it into a home, a hope, a future. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of survival, justice, and the indomitable human spirit, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what truths are waiting to be uncovered in the darkest of places.